Thank you all again for coming. It's both an honor and a pleasure to be here to talk a little bit more about the research that I do and how that research applies to how you might use educational technology in the classroom, how you might use the tools that I know there's quite a few of you have with you today to not just make things a little bit better for students, not just make them a little bit different, but to actively transform what is happening in education, to actively give new worlds of possibilities to your students, to yourselves, and to the communities that you work in. So, I'm going to be talking about my research and the model that I've developed. In fact, I'm going to be talking about two models I've developed. We'll see that in a little bit. And I'm also going to be talking about where this comes from in terms of the background and some exemplars on how you make use of the model. We're going to take a break, then Christina Bjorn will talk a little bit more about this in the context of Swedish educational practice, and then we'll come back and I want to make sure that you have a chance to ask questions in terms of how the model might be used in your specific scenarios. But let's get started with some background. Right now, we're looking at a world where many of you in your communities have started implementing one-to-one technologies. You and your students have access to machines, laptops, netbooks, iPads, whatever it may be, on a one-to-one basis, so the machine is yours to use 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no matter where you may be, no matter what else you might be doing. And that's great. But to make the best use of the machine, we need to understand the research that surrounds uses of educational technology. And some people will tell you, well, it's all very recent, there isn't much research. Those people are wrong. We actually have a wealth of research, stretching a while back. How far back? A decade or two, maybe? Actually, a little bit further than that. In fact, if we go over here to the top, to that gentleman all the way here in the upper left-hand corner, that gentleman's name is Vannevar Bush, and he published his research in 1945. So we have a fair bit of time that has elapsed between then and now. But the research that he published is as important today as it was back then. Because what Vannevar Bush published was a paper that came out of his work with two presidential administrations over roughly a decade in the United States, the Roosevelt administration and then the Truman administration, who had to deal with situations of a complexity and difficulty and scale that had never been encountered or rarely been encountered by previous presidencies in the United States, and those were the Great Depression. The response to that was the New Deal. And, of course, World War II. And what Vannevar Bush said in his paper, I'll tell you the title of the paper in just a little bit, was the following. He says, look, to deal with these things, we had to create new structures for dealing with large volumes of information, databases. Of course, a database meant a very large filing cabinet full of index cards that people were paid to quickly wheel from one office to another in government. He says, and in addition to these databases, these banks of information, we also had to have ways of crunching through the numbers, processing this data quickly and in sophisticated manner, so we had to have computers. Of course, what he meant by computers was not what we think of today as computers, but rooms full of people cranking on electromechanical calculators through the data that had just been given to them. And he says, we also needed to look at the data in different ways. We needed to be able to view different ways of understanding what all these numbers meant, what different changes meant, and so on. So they had, of course, to have graphic output for the data, which, you can guess, meant a room full of graphic artists that were given the numbers that they then told, quick, the Department of Economics needs this data now, produce 5 graphs based upon it. All right, so he said, well, this is all great, but of course it took millions of dollars and the full scale of a government to be able to do this. And he says, well, I can see the day very soon now, when all of this will be available to you on the scale of a small device about the size of a desk called a MEMX. And he says the MEMX will be able to allow you to access information, cross-connect information, view it in different ways, operate on it in different ways, etc. And you won't need millions of dollars and a government to do this. This will be available to anybody. Now, he viewed the MEMX not as an electronic device, but as an electromechanical device. For a variety of reasons that actually made sense in his day and age. Electronic computers were few, far between, incredibly expensive, and very unreliable. But other than that, the fundamental idea was correct. Now, if this was all that Vannevar Bush had said, it would be an intriguing paper in the history of technology, but not much else. But there's one more piece of information in that paper based upon the research from that decade of work that is the crucial piece. He says, well, with all of this, with this technology used in this way, when you have access to these types of large volumes of information that you can cross-connect, view in different ways, manipulate, etc., he says, we found that it indeed satisfied our needs in these presidencies and these administrations for what we needed to do. But here's the crucial thing. He says, it didn't just make people who had access to these resources think a little bit better, a little bit more carefully, come up with slightly better decisions. He says they thought differently. What we found is that the type of thought process changed. It didn't just go a little faster. It wasn't just a slight modification of what came before. It was a whole new thing, something that we had never seen before, which was good because they were dealing with problems, the likes of which had never been seen before. So Vannevar Bush titled his paper, As We May Think. The key thrust of the paper is not the technology. The key thrust of the paper is, given what the technology makes available, Vannevar Bush says, what we have found from our decade of research is people don't just think a little bit better, a little bit more deeply. He says they think differently. They think in ways that are new, that can go in places we've never gone before. And what he's foreseeing is a future where this won't just be limited to people in the upper reaches of government with access to millions of dollars worth of personnel and equipment to have this, but to anybody. All right, so that's his thesis. He bases it upon a decade's worth of research and these physical devices. But, you know, there could have been social factors, there could have been other reasons, so the thesis needed to be tested out with an actual device like the MEMX. Well, fast forward a couple of decades to late 60s, 1968 to be accurate. Okay, computers have come down in price. They're now affordable enough that, you know, colleges, universities can even afford to have a few of them around the place. And in particular, over by Stanford, there's been a research institute headed up by a gentleman, second picture there on the left, whose name is Doug Engelbart. And Doug Engelbart has been working on essentially creating, via computers, that MEMX that Vannevar Bush was talking about. And come one fine day in '68, he says, okay, I'm ready to show my results. And he does so in a presentation that lasts 1 hour. That presentation has sometimes been called the mother of all demos, because in 1 hour, Doug Engelbart showed, among other things, the mouse for the very first time in public. He showed graphical computer interfaces. He showed the capacity to cross-connect, cross-link, interlink data. He's doing this, remember, decades before the web has even been a twinkle in anybody's eye. He shows how you can take data and represent it in multiple ways as tabular information, one form of chart, connecting it to a map, connecting it to a logical visual map, etc. He shows how you can show and hide information to make it relevant or take it out of the way when it's no longer needed. He even demonstrates at one point what is one of the very first instances of doing video conferencing over a computer system, all in 1 hour. It's an incredible demo. And I strongly recommend you can go to Doug Engelbart's site and actually watch the recording of the 1 hour demo. But again, as with Vannevar Bush, the key thing is not the technology. The technology just says, hey, here's the MEMX. We now have it. Congratulations, we've made it possible. It's not quite affordable on the individual scale yet, but it's affordable on the small institution scale at the very least. Okay, well, fine, but that's not, once again not the key point of the demo. The key point of the demo is that Doug Engelbart says, and incidentally, now that we have all of this, we've been researching indeed what happens with how people think. And what he finds is that the technology doesn't just, once again, slightly improve matters. He says, we can now confirm what Vannevar Bush said, and indeed, we find that now on an individual scale, without the full government, etc., this transforms dramatically how people think. He finds that the device, this is what he's talking about, fully augments human intellect and human learning capacity. He says, again, we don't just see people thinking a little bit differently, a little bit better. We see that if you have the technology framed with all of these devices, very important, you need all of these capabilities, the capability to interact with data by cross-connecting it, viewing it graphically, etc. If you have the device with all of these capabilities, we find dramatic augmentation of human intellect and learning capacity. We find that people learn how to learn differently. So now they start coming up with ideas they could not have come up with before without the technology, not just as incremental change from what came before, but seeing new paths, new possibilities, creating new things they couldn't have created before. So he focuses his institute, and his research from that day on focuses entirely on how to best use the technology to achieve these goals, on augmenting human intellect and learning capacity. All right. So, fast forward a few more years, and in the early 70s, we have two papers, 73, that come out. One by Alan Kay, next gentleman over there, and finally, another one by Seymour Papert. The first paper by Alan Kay says, look, I've been looking at this, and this technology is great, the affordances are great, but the question is, what does it need to look like, based upon my research, okay, Alan Kay's research, I should say, to make it clear there, for it to be usable by children? What does the device need to look like for it to bring what we found is possible to a kid? And what Alan finds is that you need a device that's roughly on the scale of the child, so something about yay big, that has these capacities for interaction, for things like interacting with graphics on the screen, etc., all the capabilities that Doug Engelbart was talking about. And it has to be available to the child on a personal scale, whenever they want it, whenever they want to use it, any time of day. In other words, a one-to-one device available 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. That's what Alan finds. And at that point in time, of course, the device he's talking about could not have been built economically. It would have taken well over $100,000 to build one. The screen wouldn't have been very good, and battery life, I estimate, with the very best technology available at that point in time, would have been 6 minutes if you'd been lucky. So not a very practical device then, but Alan says, just like Vannevar Bush had said before, don't worry. The technology will come along to make this possible. It's changing rapidly, but this is what it needs to look like. And this is how it needs to be available to the child for the maximum impact. So effectively, that paper sets the base for one-to-one technologies, rather than using, say, computer labs or special buildings that you take kids to where the computers are housed, etc., etc. Finally, we get to Seymour Papert. And Seymour, again, remember this is the early 70s, has also been working with the technology and with kids for almost a decade by that point in time. And he says, look, I wanted to test this because after all, all the work to date had been with adults. What happens with kids? What happens when you make these technologies available to children, and of course you give them an appropriate set of tools to use them? So for a kid, for instance, Seymour is very interested at this point in time in mathematics in terms of how kids interact with the world of math. He says, okay, so let's give kids access to the computer technology, and let's give them access to a tool that is specifically designed for exploration of the world of mathematics in a way that they can use, they can comprehend, they can apprehend. And the tool that he creates is the computer programming language Logo. I don't know how many of you worked with Logo at some point in the past, but the key thing to remember about Logo is it's not designed as a general purpose computer language. It's designed as a computer language for exploring the world of mathematics, and it's designed as a computer language that's simple enough that even a very young child, a child in kindergarten, can write programs in it. So that's why Logo is different from BASIC and from other computer languages that were designed for other tasks. Logo was designed as a tool for mathematical exploration. Fine. We've got the computers. We've got the tool for children to explore. Seymour gets a group of 5-year-olds and turns them loose on this, basically, giving them some frameworks for exploration, and says, okay, how well are the kids doing with this? Well, many results come out of this, but the one I like to highlight is one that's perhaps clearest in conveying what happens. He says, one of the things that the kids were exploring was the concept of area, which may seem simple, but it's actually a tricky concept in more ways than one. And the question is, you have kids in kindergarten. You give them this tool, and you give them a set of, not problems really, but worlds, if you will, to explore, to think about the notion of area. After doing this, and then you run some tests, and you put the kids, you give them some tasks to complete, and you say, okay, so how well do the kids understand the concept of area? How well can they operate on the concept of area? How well can they create independently using the concept of area they've derived from interacting with this technology, with this software, with Logo? It's an improvement to write. These are 5-year-olds. Well, for some of them, the outcome that Seymour observed was that you have a 5-year-old who has the sophistication and the operative capacity relative to the concept of area that normally is only achieved by doctoral students in mathematics. Okay? I'd say that's an improvement. I'd say that's a change. It's not just an improvement. Because think of what you're doing. You're not saying the kid learns to multiply a little faster or learns a little bit better about the idea of measurement. No. You're talking about a complete sea change. You're talking about a child suddenly being able to access concepts that nobody would, in their right minds, have ever thought a child could access at that age before. Which is why Seymour calls his paper on making a theorem for a child. The name of the game here is not about improving things a little bit in terms of traditional practice for that child. It's to say, you know what? A 5-year-old can be a creative mathematician with the depth and sophistication of knowledge that we've traditionally expected of 25-year-olds, and do something with that. In other words, not just be able to just say, oh, okay, spit out the definition, but actually operate on the world, create concepts using this knowledge in the world. Again, this is not just a mere, tiny little improvement or gradual enhancement. This is a completely new world, and it's the final piece we needed in the puzzle, because that completes what I call the set of goals that we want to go for or reach or aspire to using our one-to-one technologies. In other words, in all of this early research, we see what the payoff is. The payoff is not just a small improvement in capabilities. The payoff is not, say, math, for instance, having kids do their multiplication tables a little bit better or a little bit faster or be a little bit more comfortable in calculating simple arithmetic. The goal is not to have kids remember a few more dates in history or be able to pinpoint a few places on the map in geography or read a book or two more. The goal is to completely change what is happening. Open up new worlds. Go with those children. Help those children go. Help those children choose where they're going to go in new directions. And we know that it's not a dream because all of this was not visionary, I think this is going to happen type papers. Every single one of these 4 papers that I mentioned was based upon research. Now, what's happened since the early 70s? Well, every single research paper that has been published in this area, that has done the work seriously, taking this type of approach I've described, has confirmed these results. There is not one paper that I've seen, not one, that has taken the approaches I've outlined here of providing these broad sets of tools, providing the tools for exploration, setting the stage with worlds, with rich amounts of data to analyze, comprehend, etc., that have not reported essentially the same outcomes. Not everything, of course, as dramatic as that result I mentioned from Seymour, but nonetheless, the overall framework is clear. That is indeed where we can get to. There is not a single paper that has not confirmed that. At the same time, a different line of use of computers has produced different results and not so impressive. The other line is the one where we use computers for more traditional things like drilling, practice, repetition of problems, etc. That line of research has yielded pretty minor results, to be frank. In general, you find that using computers in that way yields either not much of an improvement or very tiny improvements in student outcomes. So that's telling us that that's not necessarily a terrible way to use computers, but it's also not the most productive. It's not necessarily where you want to spend the majority of your time. All right. So we've got our technologies. We know where we want to get to with our goals. Of course, you need to figure out how to get from one to the other. It doesn't just happen by magic. Some people assume that, well, the technology is so compelling that it'll happen by itself. No, it doesn't. Okay? You need to work in certain ways. Your students need to work in certain ways. Well, to make that process easier, I want to talk about some models, 3 models to be accurate, to help you in the process, to help you in that process of figuring out what to do, how to do it, what to do first, etc. And the lens to help you focus what you do with the models into goals that correspond to what we've already identified as being accomplishable, but also within the context of where do you want to go in Sweden in your overall learning, what is embodied in the overall ensemble, if you will, of the educational practice and students in Sweden. The 3 models that I'm going to be talking about are first, the SAMR model. The SAMR model is a model I developed, which looks at the question of saying, how do we get improvements in student outcomes? What is this determined by? I'm going to show you that it's determined by a certain set of levels of use of the technology, and that in fact you can use those levels to plan out a rational, accomplishable path to improving and progressively improving student outcomes. Second model is the TPACK model. TPACK model was developed by Punia Mishra and his collaborator Köhler. And what Mishra and Köhler did was to say, well, we've got the technology, we also have content units that we want to convey, and we have pedagogical approaches that we might employ. How do these fit together? When we're designing a unit of content that employs technology and education, how do we put all of this together? How does it come together? What's the best way to do this? That's the TPACK model, which, as I said, is Mishra and Köhler. And the third model I'm going to be talking about is another model I've been working on, although I finally completed work on this model only a few months ago, so this is very recent work. And it's a model I've nicknamed the first 200,000 years of educational technology. And it's a way to give you an easy shortcut to things. It's a way of saying, look, but there's thousands of educational technologies I could use. How do I pick? Which ones are better? Which ones are worse? Well, while I can't answer for each individual case, there are some classes of technologies that have particularly effective outcomes. So when you're looking to say, what type of technology should I bring to the table? This can give you a shortcut for determining at least subsets of technologies that you might want to study, look at. And as I said before, there's that lens, and that lens is going to be given by a particular abstraction of 21st century learning goals and practices that I'll look at in a little while. So, let's get to it then. This was our backdrop. Now let's start talking about some particulars of what we're going to do. And let's start with particulars of the technologies that you're using. I want to show you 3 characteristics of the technologies that you're using that you want to keep in mind as you're designing future educational practice. This is the first one. You'll notice here we have a subway, and this gentleman over here is using a tablet, I think it's an iPad, to work while he's riding on the subway. Okay? Now there's something you can do with all of the technologies that you're using, from laptops through netbooks through tablets. Doesn't really matter. It's easier to do with a tablet, obviously, than the other ones. You know, if the subway comes to a sudden stop, you're more likely to not fall to the floor if you only have a tablet as opposed to a laptop. But the fundamental idea is, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, the technology is available to you. You don't have to go to a desk somewhere to plug it in and do something. You don't have to go to a room or a building in a specific location to have that technology to work with you. So this first principle is what I call ubiquity. As you're thinking about how to use the technology, as you're thinking about the activities you and your students might undertake, think about the fact that it can be done anywhere, anytime. You're no longer limited to just the traditional universes of what's available in school, what's available at home. Think of more of a continuum of possibilities, of locations, of practices that could be addressed by educational uses of the technology. Second principle. Lovely scene here, a mother and a child playing with one of these devices. And you notice something. The mother hasn't said to the child, "Come here, my child. Here, there's a big screen. I will set you up on a chair, and you can look at the screen side by side." No, you know, it's a comfortable scene, just as though they had a picture book in front of them. This device is not a device that's creating a barrier or an artificial separation. This is a device that is intimate to the scene. So this is the second principle for these devices: intimacy. The device is no longer a device that you go to as a separate object. Okay, I've got a piano here. Okay, pianos are wonderful things, but I don't have a piano with me. Well, I do on my smartphone, but that's another story. Not one that looks like this. Okay, nobody would say a piano is an intimate thing. These devices become, again, to varying degrees according to the device, intimate to the user, intimate to other people. You know, when we look, for instance, at how children use tablets, they don't say, like we used to see them do with, for instance, machines in a computer lab, "Okay, you come here and I'm driving and you sit behind me to watch what I'm doing," or to do a handoff of, "Okay, now you sit here." They just pass it like this. They just hand it as though it were a book or a piece of paper. They say, "Here you go." If we have it on a table, we'll see them just spin it around, just like that, okay? In other words, the device is not being thought of as something that is this big thing that's exterior. It's an intimate device to be handled in a fashion that is intimate on the interpersonal scale between people. And here's one more thing that's important about this aspect of intimacy that you want to keep in mind as you're thinking about, so what happens next with educational technology. Intimate devices, after a while, become part of the persona of the person using them. When you see somebody, for instance, coming into a room, you generally don't think, at least I don't hope you think that, "Ooh, they're wearing a shirt." No, they have a shirt. You think clothing is intimate to the person. You've taken it for granted. It's something that they have. A particular shirt may convey something about that person's persona, what they wish to convey to the world, etc., etc. But it is not something that you think about as something that is separate for that person. It is something that is taken for granted and assumed that they will have with them. The same thing happens with these devices. They become intimate in that sense too. They become assumed to others and to yourself, that you will have them with you. They're no longer something that you have to remember to go to the room with the piano to play the piano. They are intimate, and you assume that there will be a device with me that will allow me to do these things. Which leads me to the third characteristic. You have ubiquity, you have intimacy. The result is what we see here. Here's a gentleman at a museum and he's got a tablet, and he's looking at a mask, and he says, oh, nice mask, let me take a picture of it. Hey, I have a friend. Fred knows a lot about masks. Hey, Fred, here's an email. Know anything about this mask? Fred emails, yeah, I know about that mask. And you know what? There's on that second floor of the museum, on the third floor, there's another mask that's very interesting that's related to this one. You should go up a floor and take a look at it. And in the meantime, you start thinking, you know, maybe other friends would like to see this. So you take that picture and you post it to Facebook. And then you also think, you know, I've been doing a lot of drawing, and you start making some sketches on the device. And you post those sketches as well. And in the meantime, other people are telling you, by the way, here's some interesting articles. Maybe you might want to read them. And you start thinking about, gee, these masks are fascinating. Maybe I'll send a tweet out to all my students so they know about the project we're going to do in anthropology that relates to masks. Okay, and you didn't have to go anywhere else to do it. You do this in a fashion that is embedded in what you do. By virtue of being truly ubiquitous and by virtue of being intimate, the device and its uses become embedded in your daily practice. What that means is that now, because you have the device, and because it's with you always, and it's not something that you see as separate from you, but intimate to your persona, the device becomes embedded in how you think and you create 24/7. In other words, anytime, any place you are, the device becomes a gateway into finding out things, sharing things, creating things. It's not something that's away from you. It's not something that you say, make a note to later look up masks. It's embedded into your life. So those augmentation principles that we talked about before are now available to you not just when you happen to have access to the device, they're available to you anytime. Because again, those devices that make them possible are embedded. So, these three principles, ubiquity, intimacy, and embeddedness, should be a part of how you're thinking about using the devices moving forward. Different devices, of course, participate in these principles to different degrees, and that's something you want to factor into the picture. But as you're moving forward, as you're thinking how to use the technology, think about how you can bring these principles to bear. Think about how you can start moving some of the learning, some of the activities, some of the creativeness out of traditional places and into a broader spectrum. Think about how you think about things when you realize that your students aren't necessarily just going to be reading the book they're reading when they get home at this given time, but when suddenly that whole exploration, reading, creation process is stretched out, made possible by the devices over a much broader range of horizons. All right. So that's the question of the characteristics of the technology. Now I'll get to the SAMR model. And the SAMR model is a model that I created, starting with some research back in the late 80s, to address a question that was bothering me. And the question that was bothering me was the following. In the late 80s, you had a lot of software and hardware vendors saying, you know what, the key to getting the best student outcomes is to have just the best hardware and software. So you know what, this is great. Just buy our hardware and software, use it, and your student outcomes will go through the roof just because you chose the best one, and things will be golden. And you know what? Things were not golden. Things were not golden because I would see some institutions, two essentially identical institutions, with pretty much the same population of students, pretty much the same type of population of teachers, instructors, what have you, with about the same investment in professional development, who'd buy these identical technologies, and one of them would have great results with their students, and others would do terribly. And there wasn't anything like obvious mistakes and so on. So for me, the question was, well, why? Why is it that you're seeing these gaps in level of student outcome improvement when both of them are using the same underlying technologies? All right, so I spent about a decade on the research, and fast forward to past the 90s to about the year 2000, and what came out was the SAMR model. And the SAMR model says, well, okay, look, what really matters here in terms of improvement, enhancements in student outcomes is not just the technology or the particular software package that you're using. It's a question of the level of use that you're making of that technology. And we're going to see what I mean by that level. But I identified 4 crucial levels: substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. That's the progression up the ladder. And the name, of course, comes from the acronym SAMR, SAMR. And each of these levels corresponds to a progressively higher level of use. So let's start at the beginning. I'm going to do this with an example. At the substitution level, you had an old technology. You were doing, after all, things in education before the computers came around, right? So you were doing things with an older technology, and you replace it with a newer technology. But in replacing the old technology with the newer technology, you do things exactly the same way you were doing before. In other words, fundamentally, the fundamental task that you're accomplishing and how you're accomplishing it remains unchanged. Let's do an example to see what that level is talking about. Now, I used to talk about this in terms of replacing a typewriter with a word processor, but I found that more and more when I mention typewriter, people look at me and say, right, did he write here on a Ford Model T, or, you know, is he going to talk about horsewhips and buggies next? So a little bit outdated as an example. So let me use a different one right now, one that's more contemporary to some of the interesting things that are happening these days, and that would be the question of replacing paper books with e-books. And in terms of replacing a paper book with an e-book, we've heard from a lot of people that if you have paper books and you just replace them with their electronic counterparts, and we'll assume that nothing else happens, okay? So it's just a book that you used to read on paper, that's the old technology, and now you're reading it on an electronic screen, that's the new technology. You've heard claims from vendors that just by doing that, student outcomes are going to improve. Well, we now have a couple of years of research into this. You know what happens? Nothing. Student outcomes remain exactly the same as they were before, so long as you're not doing anything other than exactly what you were doing before. So if before you were reading your book on ink on pages made from dead trees, and now you're reading it on electronic LCD screens, but nothing else has changed, nothing has changed with student outcomes. They've not been hurt, but they haven't been helped either. And that's exactly what the SAMR model predicts. At the substitution level, when you're just replacing an older technology with a newer technology and doing exactly the same thing you were doing before, the outcomes are exactly the same. So, does that mean that doing something at the substitution level is bad and we shouldn't do it? No. But it means that we have to view it as setting the stage for other things to build up upon it, because I would assume that we do want our student outcomes to change. We do want our students to be reaching those higher goals that we had talked about earlier. All right, so that's the lowest level, substitution. At the augmentation level, suddenly the technology, you say, well, I'm not going to use it exactly the same way I was using it before. I'm going to use it so that I have some functional improvements over what I was doing before. In other words, the task I'm asking the students to do remains essentially at heart the same. But I'm going to add some functional improvements in terms of how they can use the tool, which in turn mean that some aspects will be made a little bit better, a little bit easier, etc. Now let me be clear about what I mean here by a functional improvement. A functional improvement you might think about with an e-book reader is to say, well, look, in an e-book, if I have a word, I can just tap on any word and get its dictionary definition. So a student doesn't have to have the dictionary next to them. That's a functional improvement, right? Yeah, but it's kind of a small one. In other words, that improves matters a little bit, but it improves matters a little bit in the sense of saying, well, it's a convenience factor. Before, the student had to keep a dictionary next to them. Now they can tap a word and get the dictionary definition. It is true that students will use those built-in definitions more than they would have used the traditional dictionary. But to be perfectly honest with you, we find that it doesn't produce much of an improvement in outcomes. So that is indeed a functional improvement, but it's what we call a convenience functional improvement. The types of functional improvements that really start to make a change here at the augmentation level are the ones that relate to functional improvements that you could not have accomplished at all, convenience or otherwise, with the older technology. Let me give you an example here. In the case of the ebook reader, just like I could on traditional paper, I can make notes in the margin, I can highlight text, I can make a note on a page that says, for this, go to page 92 to see some more text related to this. I can do all of that in both formats. But there's one thing I can do with the ebook reader that I cannot do with the paper book. In any good ebook reader, there's an option to push a button and have all those highlighted texts, all those notes I typed in, etc., exported to a text file that then I can either use myself for other purposes, I can share with other people by email, by Twitter even, what have you. And that's not something that's available to me in the traditional paper format. Okay, you're going to say, wait a second, Ruben, but you could have gone through the traditional paper book and transcribed all those highlights, annotations, etc., into a separate document, right? Couldn't you? Yeah, and if you have any student that actually does that, please come see me after these talks. Because I really want to meet this student. I really have never met a student, or anybody for that matter, that would actually do that. In other words, that's a hypothetical. In real practice, the amount of time and effort required to do that would be prohibitive, whereas in this case, it's just push one button and you have it. Now, we know that that's already a useful thing, because a student who have asked to write, say, an essay based upon that book that they read, now has access to all of that material in preparing their essay in a form that is readily available to them while they're writing. They've got all of that condensed, compiled into a single form. They can easily send some of it out to a classmate. Hold on to that thought. We may do something with that in just a minute. So at the augmentation level, when I have this type of improvement, this functional improvement that goes beyond the convenience factor, to allowing me to do things I could not have done with the older technology, I do start seeing at this augmentation level changes, improvements in student outcomes that are small but significant. Now, of course, you may want to ask, well, what do you mean by small and significant? In fact, a lot of my research was spent trying to track down data so I could quantify this. But to give you a rough ballpark idea, we're talking about the type of improvements in student outcomes that correspond roughly to a fraction of a letter grade. Not bad, noticeable, but on the other hand, not the sort of thing that you're going to run out and call the press about. These two levels taken together are what I call the enhancement levels, because while they provide either no change in student outcomes or a small change in student outcomes, nonetheless, you're enhancing your practice in such a way that you set the stage for bigger things as you go along. All right, let's go to the next level. At the modification level, we say, well, you know what? So far, we've left the task that we asked the students to do, which was read the book individually and write an essay individually, pretty much the same, even though I did include those functional improvements to make the task a little bit easier, a little bit better, etc. But let's start thinking about, well, let's redesign that task. So in task redesign, what I'm looking at is saying, okay, I'll keep the core, the heart of the task the same, but I will make some significant changes to the design of the task that are important for me in terms of educational goals, important to students in terms of their outcomes. And here's the change I'm going to make in my specific example. In the ebook reader example, I'm going to ask the students to, as they read, not after they've read everything, but as they read, use that exporting function for their notes, their highlights, etc., to share those notes, highlights, etc., with their fellow students. That's going to be a task redesign, number one, because I've taken this from being an individual, isolated reading to being a form of informal social reading. Notice that this is very different from telling them, read the entire book and then get together on Friday to discuss it with your classmates. You're saying, make available to others your thoughts, highlights, etc., as you're going along. Come back to what that gives you in just a second. I'm going to mention the other significant task redesign I'm going to do here, which is to say, you're still going to be writing your essay individually, but instead of giving it to me as an essay that you turn in on paper, etc., I'm going to ask you to publish it in a blog, which is going to also, I'm going to ask that you also read some of your fellow students' essays on their blogs and comment on them as they will on yours. So those are going to be the two aspects of the task that I'm going to redesign. It's a significant redesign for the modification level, and let's look at a few things about it. First, it's very clear that this is only doable because of the technology. Yes, in the past, it was possible for you to take those papers from the students and say, I'll photocopy them and give every student a copy of the paper. The fact of the matter is the medium and how you're doing it pretty much guaranteed that that paper was going to be canary cage lining. Okay? Not a very good way of getting comments and so on. To really do this, we now know from research that the dynamics afforded by the electronic medium of the blog are very different from those of traditional paper handing out and lead to actually much richer commentary. And I already said that the type of social reading that's made possible by that sharing of the comments that you write in the margins is very different from wait, read the whole thing, try to say, well, I'll just package this into what I understood and timidly discuss that with your classmates at the end of the week. But what does it afford you? Well, think about what it affords you. One of the things that happens when students can see each other's highlights, comments, etc., as they're reading, is that suddenly you're giving them a window not into just the final finished thoughts as they thought they should be presented to others. You're giving them a window into the raw material of commentary thinking of their fellow classmates. I thought this was important, but they didn't highlight it. They think it wasn't important. I was puzzled by this. I put a big question mark next to it in the margin. Oh, wait, they explained it. Oh, I see, that's important. That's great, now I understand it. What? You think that that character does what? No, this character means that. See this all in a raw format without having to interrupt their process, without having to interrupt the reading process. They've acquired a social dimension in terms of gaining access to their counterparts' thinking. We know from research into formative assessment practices, I'll refer you to William and Black, that this is among the most valuable things that we can do with students. In other words, our research into formative assessment says any time that students have a window into their fellow students' thinking patterns, anytime that they can understand better how other students are reading, how they're learning to read, how they're learning to learn, we get dramatic improvements in student outcomes. And similarly, any time that you have that type of informal commentary dimension that's afforded by publishing the essays not just on a piece of paper to be handed to teacher and that's it, but by being shared among a broader group with ongoing commentary as an expectation, you also get much better results in terms of students understanding their work and understanding how to improve that work. So clearly, the task is still at heart the same. Read a book, write an essay on it. But also equally clearly, I've made a significant redesign to that task that is afforded only because of the possibilities of the new technology. With those two things, I'm at the modification level. And now, suddenly, I start seeing significant improvement in student outcomes. How significant? Again, this is Roth, etc., but on the order, on the scale of the equivalent of 1 letter grade or so. Now that's something that you might want to call the papers about. It's getting more interesting. It's getting more towards what Seymour and the rest of all those pioneers, if you will, could see happening. But there's still one more level left, and that's the redefinition level. And at the redefinition level, what you have is what happens when people say, well, you know what? I'm not just going to significantly redesign the old task, but keep the heart of the task the same. I'm going to create a whole new task that I could never have done before without the introduction, without the use of the technology. In this new task, I'm of course going to want to accomplish some important educational goal that I could have accomplished only partially or incompletely or not at all before. Otherwise, there would be no point in doing this exercise. But the key thing is I'm creating a whole new task, not just modifying or redesigning part of the old task as I did at the modification level. So in this level, the first thing to keep in mind is you're saying, okay, I'm creating a new task. Very important for you to realize that this means that the old task that you were doing before either has to be eliminated or at the very least cut back significantly or partially wrapped up into the new task because days have 24 hours. And if you keep stacking one task on top of another, you're going to need 27 hours and 30 hours, and pretty soon you can't stretch the day any further, not that I would stretch in the first place, so that doesn't work. One of the most common problems I see, one of the most common areas where I see people failing in terms of introduction of technology into the classroom is when people say, I have a good idea, but I want to play it safe. So to play it safe, I'm going to keep the old activity and I'm going to add the new activity to it. You know what happens? There isn't enough time to do the old activity, there isn't enough time to do the new activity, everything falls apart. Okay? Don't do that. When you bring in a new activity, it's time to let go of part or all of the old. Okay. So let's look at an example here for the redefinition level with our ebook reader. And I say, okay, so far I've been asking the students to write an essay. That's been the task I've put before them. And that's been great, etc. But now let me push things in a direction I couldn't have gone prior to the introduction of the technology. Instead of asking them to write an essay, I'm going to ask them to create a digital storytelling project. For instance, it could be a digital video project that also expresses their response to their understanding, etc., of the text. Now here's where you say, wait a second, Ruben, wait a second. You could have made a digital video project before. You would have done it maybe not digitally with a camcorder or even with a Super 8 camera. Wouldn't that have been the same? So why would that have been inconceivable without the technology? Well, two things. One, if you ever did one of those projects, you know that they were difficult, expensive, the sort of thing you only did once a term, the sort of thing that went very badly because of the huge amount of time and resources you had to invest in them, and most importantly, even if you did them, the sort of thing you could only do as a culminating project, and importantly, without an edit cycle. And that's the second thing that is only made possible by technology. Because no matter how good your 8mm camera or your analog recording setup was, you still only had so much of it, and you could never get a true edit cycle going. So if a student did something and said, well, that's great, but I want to change it, there was no way to do that with the same fluidity that you would do for an essay. For an essay, there's always an edit cycle. We know that good writing, teaching students how to write well, coherently, etc., requires frequent and rich revision throughout with lots of commentary, lots of revision. Well, to get the same type of depth of thinking in the digital video format, you need a digital video edit cycle where you're providing that same type of, no, this is understandable, this is not understandable, go back, fix this, think about this. That type of rich cycle has only become possible with the advent of the technology. So that's why I'm saying that this was previously inconceivable. And there's another benefit, that's the other thing I want to highlight about doing this. Sometimes when we ask students to write an essay about something, there's an easy way, not easy perhaps, but a relatively easy way for a student who hasn't really understood or come to terms with the text to deal with it. They say, I don't really understand this, but you know what? I can paraphrase pretty well. And if I paraphrase pretty well, I can hide from myself and from others the fact that I didn't really understand this. And while a good teacher will highlight some of that, let's face it, it's rare for a student to fail an assignment for doing that. So students learn to get by on paraphrase. That's not something you can do if you say, no, I'm putting you in another medium. I'm telling you, don't just use text. I'm telling you, create a digital video. You have to use all of the expressive formats afforded to you by digital video in your response. So now you have to use sound, visuals, development in time, etc., as elements of you showing me how you understood the original text. No hiding behind paraphrasing there. All right, if I just did this, that would already be a significant improvement. It would be a significantly new task. It would take me up to the redefinition level. But I have this thing about always liking to see, can I push it just a little further, get a little more ambitious on this? Let's get a little more ambitious on this one. Because we're doing this in a medium that has now become an easy-to-share medium, courtesy of places like YouTube and Vimeo, I'm going to ask the students to not just give me or just their peers this video. I'm going to ask them to push a button and publish it out on YouTube or Vimeo, whichever site you want. And I'm going to ask them to harvest and respond to commentary, feedback from a genuine audience, an authentic audience that goes beyond the bounds of their classroom, their peers. Very interesting. Very interesting for several reasons. Number one, once again, made possible only through the technology. You try taking an 8mm film and distributing it broadly and getting lots of commentary from a huge audience in the old days. But in addition to that, some very important things. Not only are the students getting a broader range of feedback from people who are not in their immediate circle who say, well, geez, you haven't been talking with me for days about this, and I'm looking at this, and I don't understand what on earth you meant with this. And, telling them exactly what's wrong, and the student having to say, maybe I didn't make myself perfectly clear there, or maybe I don't understand this clearly. So not only are you getting that broader range of feedback, which is incredibly valuable, but another thing we know from research into formative assessment, once again, William and Black, is that whenever you give students an authentic audience, they're also more motivated to perform. Students perform better by virtue of the fact that they're being told, you've got an audience that isn't just your teacher and your peers, it's an audience that's as much of the world as you want to bring into this particular project. Not only are they getting that broad feedback from the rest of the world, they're also performing better. They're motivated to do better things, because they've got that. Once again, that drives their accomplishment, the outcomes higher, and it's desirable. Great. This is also at the redefinition level, also desirable. One more time. I'm not done yet. I can't just quite let it go yet. So I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to say, well, in addition to all of this, I'm going to make sure that that authentic audience incorporates one group of people that is very important. And to understand this, I'm going to have to take a step back and think about the text that I gave the students in the first place. The text I gave the students in the first place could, of course, be anything, but let's assume now, because of how I was thinking, how I was going to make the maximum use of my summer build-up, that I chose not just any old text. Let's assume I chose a text that deals with a contemporary serious issue, catastrophe, etc. Let's assume, for instance, that I chose a text dealing and produced by people who were in Japan at the time of the tsunami. And if you've been following the literature that's been coming out of Japan in the wake of the tsunami and events like Fukushima, but there's some amazing writing coming out of there. Absolutely amazing. The sort of thing that you definitely want your students reading. But it's hard literature. I mean, this deals with experiences, culture, etc., that are pretty alien to most of your students. And they're going to have to deal with lots of things they've never encountered before. So these are texts that are going to really require that your students come to grips with some things. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use one of those texts as the basis for this exercise. But in addition to everything I've talked about so far, part of that audience, and I'm going to make sure that that audience is part of this by soliciting it explicitly, is going to be people who were in Japan at the time of the tsunami. Maybe some of the writers that are writing these texts. I'm going to ask that they comment on what the students are producing. Now, if I do this, think suddenly about what becomes possible here. Because what you're talking about is your students are getting feedback, all right, from that authentic audience, but that authentic audience has a direct experience of that which is described in the text, unlike anybody else's who could give feedback to that student. They can say for instance, you know, kid, you really got this. I have to congratulate you. You really understood this. No, kid, you missed it. That's not what it was like at all. Here's what it was like. Wow, you know something, kid? You had an insight there that I've never heard somebody hear. You've helped me understand something about this. Thank you. Huh, that's interesting, but have you considered about these other things you might want to bring into your analysis? That perspective of getting authentic feedback from the audience that is directly connected to the object of study is unbelievably valuable to a student. Not just because it increases their horizons, not just because it provides them with additional perspectives, but also because it puts them in the position of saying, I am dealing with a text produced by the other, but I now have to work with, deal with, engage the other, not as some remote exotic being, but as somebody that is engaging me reciprocally as a peer to myself. Suddenly, the other is no longer in the place of the remote other. The other is in the place of that other that stands in front of me, that I engage ethically, that I engage with awareness, that I engage as a peer to myself, as somebody in a dialogue about what I think, what I do, what I create. That's an incredibly valuable experience, and that's one which I maintain whenever we have a possibility to do so. We have a responsibility to make available to our students. All right, I've pushed this far enough. I'm happy with it. I definitely have something at the redefinition level. Again, any of those elements I mentioned would have already taken it there, but I just wanted to show you the scope of what is possible. I'm at the redefinition level. I've created a new task that has incredibly new valuable aspects to what I can accomplish to my students that I could not have accomplished before without the technology. What type of improvements in student outcomes can I expect? From my research, tasks work at the redefinition level can improve student outcomes by as much as the equivalent of roughly 2 letter grades. Let me put this in other terms. That means that your students who were failing before are now above average. And those students who were above average before are going places you've never seen students go before, those places that Seymour and the rest of the people I mentioned before were talking about. That's the payoff at the redefinition level. That's why you want to go there. Now, you also saw that I built this up as a ladder. We went from first start substitution, then we built to augmentation, then we built to modification, and finally we built to redefinition. We started with the enhancement levels, and then we went up to the transformation levels, the ones where we see the most dramatic impact. And this is something you want to think about for yourself. You don't have to start at the redefinition level. In fact, I don't recommend that you do so. You can start at the substitution level, where you already have working teaching practice, and say, how do I adapt my existing practice to the new tools? Bring in some of the augmentation, maybe, and start there. Once you're comfortable there, build up. Might take a few months, might be to the next year, and then say, okay, now I'm ready to significantly redesign my tasks and go to the modification level. And finally, you've reached a level of comfort and you're steady there, so maybe the next time around, you go to the redefinition level. So you don't have to think about, okay, I have to do everything at the top right from the start, but you do want to have that as your ultimate goal. You have to have some idea of ultimately where it is you're going to get to, and then build up reasonably, gradually, at a rhythm at which you're comfortable through the other levels. You just don't want to stagnate. You don't want to stay too long at the lowest levels. All right. That's the SAMR model. At this point, we're ready to take a pause, ready for you to have a short break. After the break, Christina will be back to talk more about this, and then after that, I will continue with the rest of the models, some more exemplars, and Q&A. See you in a few.